might be all about the vehicles, but it's the people behind them who really steer the story. Welcome to Fleet Legends, an interview series all about passing down hard earned fleet knowledge sponsored by Legend Fleet. I'm Lauren Fletcher, Bobbitt's VP of Content, and today I'm sitting down with someone whose impact on this industry runs deep. If you've been in fleet for a while, there's a good chance you've heard his name or felt his influence, even if he's been out of the day to day spotlight for a bit. Robert Martinez is one of those true long-timers with close to 4 decades of real-world experience with the NYPD, a decade with his own fleet consulting company, and a track record of rolling up his sleeves, guiding teams through change, and making sure others grow right alongside him. Robert, I am so excited to get you on this series.
Thank you for that great introduction.
All right, well,
Wow.
let's jump right on in. So, every legend has what we call an origin story. Why don't you tell us how you got started in the industry?
So, yes, I'll start actually with high school. I actually went to an automotive high school, a vocational high school, technical vocational high school. And in my senior year, I had the option to work in a motorcycle shop while I was attending school. So the motorcycle van would come and pick me up at high school at lunchtime, and I would spend the second half of my day working on motorcycles. And that's basically how I got started into fleet. And along with that job, that was my first real job besides a paper route. And then when I got married, I decided to open up my own motorcycle shop because I thought I knew everything about running a business. Found out after a couple of years, after going out of business, that I didn't know everything. Went back to work for that same motorcycle shop, but they had a contract with the NYPD. We were selling scooters and parts to them. So then I started to have babies, and my first baby, I had to pay out of pocket for everything. So I needed benefits. So when the parts guy came to pick up parts, I said, how do I get a city job with benefits? And he goes, well, give me your resume. And lo and behold, they hired me to work for the NYPD. And my first day on the job, they got a delivery of 28 Harley Davidson motorcycles. And so my first day on the job, believe it or not, they put me in the motorcycle shop. And next thing I know, I mean, I didn't even know what fleet was. And, the term fleet, even mechanics that work in the fleet, they don't think as fleet being fleet. They think as it's a job. They're fixing police cars or fixing vehicles. They don't really look at the bigger picture. And unless you get in, management and up into the higher levels, do you think as fleet being fleet? It's just, you're a mechanic and you got to, work on these vehicles and keep them running and stuff. So, but that was how I got started. Originally motorcycle shop, and then going out of business was a great lesson. But having benefits was really the driving force of me getting out of me owning my own business and working for the government.
I love it. There's always a falling into fleet story, and that one's unique. That's great. um, Reflecting back on your fleet career, what were some of the more significant changes that you saw? I'm sure there were a lot in almost 4 decades. What were some of the biggest ones?
Yeah, 4 decades. I know I keep it makes me feel old, but and I'm still having the problem even digesting that I'm coming up on 66 years old. For some reason, I got to 60 and never thought I. And then people ask me how old I am. I some reason I keep telling them I'm 60, and I have to remember that I'm going to be 66. But during that time frame, a lot has changed. Obviously, I mean, when I first got into the fleet side, we were still on index cards. We had a card for each vehicle. Vehicle came in, we put down, we'd make a notation of the next time. Even replacing vehicles. If a vehicle got what we called condemned or taken out of service, we knew we had to replace it with one. So this guy had this ledger that he had. He would put the vehicle number down, and then he would mark next to it which vehicle replaced it, or he knew he needed a vehicle to replace it. So everything went from paper index cards, and then originally, then we started getting computers, and I was actually at that time already getting out of the motorcycle shop, getting a little bit more into the administrative end of things after a few years. And they gave me one of the first computers in the NYPD. And that computer was to enter the new vehicles into the computer system. And it literally was the only computer that fleet services had, was to enter these vehicles into the system that eventually everybody was going to have. And then now, everybody has computers, and now we got telematics, we got GPS, and now key performance indicators are automatically generated. We're not doing them with spreadsheets manually like we used to.
Yeah. That's a huge change, especially again with time savings and accuracy and so much else that goes into such manual data entry.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. We developed all our own systems. We had some really good people that were good with Excel and stuff, and we actually called it the monster. We would feed the monster, so we would add all this data into this system, and it was generate. It would even generate, what vehicles we should be buying, life cycles and stuff. And but it was all manual. And when that one particular guy retired, there was nobody who could really pick it up. And thank God it became available commercially that we could buy a system that could do it for us.
Creating a better day for the legends of the road with the non-slip van floors, protective interior liners, and full range of work van accessories. Trusted by major OEMs and fleets all across North America and Europe.
Well, if we were to take a moment, I think this is probably one of my favorite questions. We hop into a little virtual time machine for a second. If you could go back in time, what's one thing you wish you would have known when you first started out?
Um, well, when I first got in, because I was open-minded and always wanted to do things, there was bosses above me that didn't see eye to eye with the way I went about stuff and thought about stuff. And I guess I didn't realize they felt me as a threat. And this actually happened early on in my career. So the first was figuring out how to get my bosses to listen to me and how to get them not to, for lack of better words, hate me. Literally, we had an employee suggestion program, and I used to write employee suggestions, and they hated me for it, because they were very limited minded to some extent, and they really didn't want to listen to me. And they felt by me writing employee suggestion, I was going over their head, and it created work for them, So that was a big problem. And at one point, they built an office for me, put me in the office, and told me I had to stay in that office and just do whatever administrative work they gave me. And for many years, I just thought they were so much smarter than me. I thought they saw the bigger picture, they knew more about stuff. And then as I went up the, for lack of better words, the corporate ladder, which, or I guess the government ladder in my case, I started to see that they were really not that much smarter than me. In fact, it was just the opposite. And eventually I, went to the ultimate. I went from being I started as a helper mechanic and I retired as a deputy commissioner. Nobody will probably ever do that again. Maybe one or two, but, it was just timing was right. I was in the right place at the right time. But most of my director and deputy directors that at the fleet division, I don't know if you ever heard of the Peter principle, but they basically, the Peter principle was in effect. So they got promoted to the point that, in my opinion, and now looking back, it's not my opinion. I think 100%. They weren't competent in being able to do their job. They just got promoted, in a particular spot at a particular time. They got the job. Maybe politics, maybe corruption. All of the above. That's, could have driven them get into those positions, but they weren't good for the organization. But it was a great learning curve for me because as I developed and went up the food chain, I was able to counteract all of that. And believe it or not, today after I retired, a lot of that reverted back. A lot of that, because in the NYPD we have a civilian workforce and a uniform workforce, and we work together and sometimes against one another. And I was able to bring that together because I didn't care if you were uniform or civilian. If I needed a job done and you were there and you had the capability of doing it, I didn't say, he's a uniform, I'm not going to use him. We all worked together and we made it one big family. So, but I think the biggest thing was figuring out how to get my bosses to listen to me. Was probably the hardest thing because I had to eat crow a couple times and just whether I liked what they said or not, I had to kind of go with the flow.
And I can imagine that really impacted how, as you became a leader, you listened to other people and their advice because you had that experience of trying to be heard and trying to speak up and not being listened to. I think that really goes interestingly into the next question I have, which is, experience clearly doesn't come easy. What were some of the most important lessons you learned in fleet management that you think are really crucial for new fleet managers to understand, like speaking up and not giving up?
Yeah. So, yeah, to be true and honest, mostly with yourself, you need to, go back and look in that mirror. And certainly after I retired, those that might have noticed some of the news reports and things that came out in New York City with the past mayor and people and corruption within the police department, I was indirectly involved with all that, and that was had a lot to do with me retiring. But to be true and honest with yourself, to be able to look yourself in the mirror. And trust is so important. They say trust is the lubrication for organizations. Whether it's private or government. Building trust and being trustworthy, and learn and be open minded. Understand that your employees are your number one asset. Trust them, believe in them, and give them a seat at the table.
And from your perspective, are there any rookie mistakes that you've seen new fleet managers make or that maybe you made that you would recommend folks steer clear of?
Well, early on was that I was not crazy with my thinking that the way the director and deputy director were running the place. One example was we early on. We got a decal machine in to be able to make our own decals, and the deputy director didn't want anybody to use it, so we got the machine in, and he kept it in his closet. He wouldn't let anybody use it. So it was just stuff like that. So one was that I wasn't crazy. And then, like I say, as I went up the food chain, I was able to see that a lot of stuff I was being told and what have you. So especially when I went up to the deputy director. Well, originally I was the executive director, then deputy commissioner. Is that so? The Fleet Service Division reported to the Support Services Bureau. And in 2010, they took me out of division. They brought me up to the bureau. So now I wasn't just in charge of fleet. I was in charge of property clerk, central records, printing, and fleet. So now I went from 400 people to 900 people, $80 million budget, $180 million budget. So but we were so controlled by support services. It was like like the man behind the curtain. And when I went there, it was like an office with 20 people in it. And I went there for meetings, but I never really comprehended that they weren't this big, mighty organization. It was just a chief and a handful of people in the office. But we feared them like crazy. And I'm like, why did we fear them? And then, so I got the position through some politics that I wasn't aware of. I got a call one day from the first deputy commissioner. Did I want to take more responsibility? And I said, okay. And I just, got my master's from NYU in executive management. And I was already working with the mayor's office on evaluating, privatization versus, still we're doing our own repairs and stuff. So I thought it had something to do with that. And he says, well, don't tell anybody. And then he calls back. Now I never spoke to this man. And then 4 hours later, he calls back. Well, Commissioner Kelly just approved it. You're going to be in charge of the bureau starting Monday, but don't tell anybody. And this is on a Friday afternoon. I was like, am I being punked here? Did this really happen? I mean, no application, no nothing. So I took that job, and I walk in on Monday, and then we get something that came up, some big event, and we needed overtime, and it was always a big problem getting overtime. So I said, what do I have to do to approve this overtime? Because it was going to be maybe 15, 20,000 dollars with overtime. And they go, well, you have the authority to approve the overtime. I said, well, how come, in the past we had to jump through hoops to get the overtime approved and get it, we were told we had to get approved by the first deputy commissioner and he got it. I found out that none of that was true, that
Oh my
I
gosh.
had the ability to approve it. So, so from that day forward, whenever we needed overtime, I would schedule overtime. I mean, even snowstorms, they would only tell us an hour before a snowstorm that we had to hold on the mechanics to put chains on. Because years ago, we didn't have four-wheel drive police cars. We had to put
Right.
chains on the cars, right? So we'd have to open up all the shops and figure out who's going to work, and then 12-hour tours. But they wouldn't tell us until an hour before the end of the day that we had to stay and work overtime. So So, I was able to see that, if a big storm was coming 24 hours ahead of time, we would schedule overtime, let people, get their families ready, prepare their families. Because, guys have kids at home, wives have to work sometimes, kids have to go to school. So
Yeah.
if you have 24-hour notice before a major event, you can, take care of your family and stuff like that. So that was a big learning curve that, had a lot more. The head of the bureau had a lot more power and authority and latitude to do things than what we were ever told at the division level. And we never. I was the only one to break that wall, to break that ceiling, to get to that level. And then I spent 12 and a half years at the executive level in the NYPD, and was the longest serving deputy commissioner to date with the NYPD, because every new commissioner gets new people. So I worked for 5 police commissioners. I'm the only one who has ever done that.
Wow.
And what was interesting is every time a new commissioner comes in, there'd be a transition team would come in, and I'd be waiting to be interviewed by the transition team, and I wouldn't get interviewed. So I'm like, am I being fired? Because you're supposed to have a letter of resignation prepared. If they actually leave, you're supposed to leave, voluntarily. And I never wanted to do that, but I had to be prepared. And every time I never got interviewed, and they said, "No, you're staying, Bob." And I realized that no one wanted my job, probably because, if you think fleet's hard to run, try running the property clerk for the NYPD. We have 5 different, impound yards and property. We have more guns, drugs, and money than the biggest drug deal in the world in one warehouse, and we have 5 warehouses. So, talk about, and literally $60 million on the shelf of confiscated cash. So,
Well, I think, aside from not having anybody wanting to do it, I think, you've proved you actually knew what you were doing through all those years as well.
yeah, well, at least give the illusion. But it was good, and I liked it. I enjoyed it. The people were good. We would have weekly meetings, and like I say, I did have, so besides my hands-on experience, I did have, I did go to school, so I have an engineering degree in electromechanical engineering, a 2-year degree in mechanical engineering technology, and then I went to NYU for executive management, and then I also spent some time at the Kennedy School at Harvard University. So, so in addition to my hands-on experience and learning people, I have a formal background in executive management, and that reassured my way of thinking on management and being a good manager and a good leader.
Well, that actually, I think, leads really good into the next question that I want to ask, which is, running a fleet's one thing, but leading a team through ups and downs, especially what you've discussed, is an absolutely entirely different challenge. I mean, what strategies did you use to build and lead a successful team that kept going through all of this?
Yeah. So the first was being consistent, and treating everybody with respect. So my theory, and one thing I learned along the way, was that whether someone's the cleaner or a deputy director, you need to have a little bit of empathy for them, and they all have good ideas. One of the lessons, I think, I don't know if it was Kennedy School or at NYU, was one of the lessons was there was a hospital in Maryland that had a staph infection, and they couldn't figure out how to get rid of staph. And they have these, some of the best doctors in the world at this hospital, and so they had a meeting going on, and this was going on for a while. So they had a cleaning woman in the meeting. Oh, she was actually taking care of, I think, serving coffee or something, but she was really cleaning. And she overheard them talking. She goes, "Can I say something?" And they go, "Sure." She says, "Well, you have this staph infection, but I noticed a couple of things." And the doctors are like looking at her like, she says, "Well, I noticed that the doctors bring their pens from patient to patient to patient, and they're writing on the charts with the same pen, and there was something else that I don't know, maybe even using the same clipboard or something. I forgot exactly what it was. There was a couple of things that the doctors were bringing. So it turned out the doctors were the one bringing the staph infection from room to room to room. So they made a policy that nothing goes from room to room, and they had to, put the protective clothing on. But most importantly, every room had its own pen tied to the clipboard, and it didn't go room to room. So this woman who was not a doctor came up, and they were able to, in a short period of time, correct the situation with the thing. So, the other thing, mistake I made, goes back a little bit to the past question, was that when I got to the upper level at the bureau, they had that staff of 20 people. I didn't clean house, and I wanted to give everybody a chance to stay that was already there. I didn't want to just get rid of everybody. And that was probably one of my biggest mistakes, was not cleaning house, because there was a certain allegiance to the past people that worked there, both on the uniform civilian side, and that ended up being a costing me and becoming a big problem for me, because kept communicating with the other bosses that were there prior, and then they were causing me some trouble that really became a problem down the road. So even though I don't like that term clean house when you go into a new office, and we talked about corporate knowledge earlier. Some corporate knowledge is not good corporate knowledge, but not all corporate knowledge is good. So to just keep someone because they have corporate knowledge isn't a good enough reason. If they have productive corporate knowledge or something that you think is solid, but if the corporation is not running well, you want to get rid of that corporate knowledge, right? You want to come in with new corporate knowledge. So you got to balance that out. What is good corporate knowledge and what is not. So that's just a point that I should have brought out a little earlier. So the other is never stop learning, and never stop sharing what whether it's within your organization or with other fleet. I mean, I've been going to conferences, I've been a member of NAFA for 20 something years. I taught sessions at the NAFA, at GFX, I taught sessions, and when you teach a session, you network, you learn both. When you share, you learn. Networking is just so important. We learn lessons that we won't forget. But one of the best lessons and best way to learn lessons, both yourself and your employees, is learning from your mistakes. So there's times where I knew an idea probably wasn't the right idea, but if no one's going to get hurt and it's not going to cost the agency or the company a lot of money, sometimes you let them make that mistake. And maybe you're wrong. Maybe it's not a mistake, right? You think it might be a mistake. You let them go down that road, and you will both learn. Was this the right way to do it? Years ago in my motorcycle shop, I had a frozen axle that I was trying to take off a motorcycle. I had a mechanic that worked for me that came in late in the day, and I was working on this thing for like 2 or 3 hours trying to get this frozen axle out. He comes in, looks at it from a different point of view, and literally he had it done in like 5 minutes. He just said, well, rather than try to get the axle turned, why don't you take the nut off the other side and then hit it with an air hammer? And many times having it from another point of view helps a lot too.
Yeah, it ties, I think, really well back to the example that you gave of the staph infection and the cleaning woman. Listening to ideas that might not come from traditional places and being willing to give that voice a space may prove to be more valuable than you realize.
Yeah. I have that trouble with my wife sometimes. I automatically kind of shut it down sometimes, and then I realize afterwards I should have let her talk more because she was right and I was wrong. And but now I'm older, I can relate to that a lot more. But and even my daughters and stuff, sometimes you know. You talk to all these mechanical background people, and they look at it from one point of view, and you get someone that doesn't have a mechanical background, they look at it from a totally different point of view. Meanwhile, because of that clean way of thinking, to some extent, they have a better way of doing it because they just think of it a little more logically or not logically from the mechanical perspective.
No, and I think that is absolutely valuable. Different perspectives, different points of view, and again, just giving them the space and having yourself know they might be wrong or you might be wrong, but being willing to being open, I think, is just so key.
Yeah. Well, that part I'm still trying to teach my wife.
I was gonna say I'll send her the clip of you saying that she was right, but maybe not with that one. So let's look ahead for a minute. We're gonna jump back into that virtual time machine because one thing I know, the next generation of fleet managers, they're watching, they're looking for new careers, they're thinking about what they want to do, and our goal is to have someone say, "I wanted to be in fleet when I grew up." So fleet is always evolving. What advice would you give to new entrants joining or looking to join the fleet management industry?
Well, I would say on the technology front is, I mean, like we already mentioned, they have it a lot easier. So, when it comes to the big change, game changers, I would say is GPS and telematics. I mean, it's just the information you're getting back is just priceless. I mean, everything from vehicle utilization. I mean, one of the big problems we had years ago, especially with index cards, was fleet creep. Whatever vehicle we got, we kept it, and we would have no idea whether it was being used every day or not, whether it was in the parking lot. We used to do key performance indicators and look at the amount of money it takes to keep a vehicle on the road. And we would notice that year 1 and 2 of a vehicle, when we put it into service, it didn't have much. And then year 3, the maintenance cost went up. Year 4, the maintenance. Then we got to year 6 or 5, and the maintenance cost went down to almost nothing. And we're like, wow, we should keep a vehicle forever, because the older it is, the less it. Well, the reason being, it's parked in a lot, not being used because it's old, because no one uses the old car. So you got to be careful of the data and that. So GPS just telling you, whether the vehicle's being, and telematics, now the telematics is so married to the GPS now. Originally it was just located. Now we get so much more information back through the cars, and the cars are rolling computers. There's more computer technology in a car than an F-14 plane, from what I understand. So with that said, I would say GPS and telematics really is a game changer. I mean, if you have a fleet, it could be as small as, 10 vehicles, and you don't have GPS. I mean, everything from learning whether the vehicle is being utilized to supporting you when you're being sued, in tort court, with an accident. GPS only tells the truth. It's unbiased, right? So
Yeah.
if your GPS tells you that the vehicle was, going the speed limit and stopping at the red lights, and it got into an accident, you can fight that and say and pay. You save one lawsuit with a GPS system, you probably pay for your whole GPS system, right? Because everybody sues for millions of dollars. So GPS and what it can save you on that side of it, and then utilization. And even geofences and stuff, and then even on misuse of vehicles, right? It just keeps multiplying on what GPS can do on making your fleet efficient and keeping everything on its toes, and keeping even though it is Big Brother watching to some extent, humans need Big Brother watching sometimes, because there was a lot of over the years, everybody a little bit would misuse their vehicles from time to time, and certainly you're making sure and then the telematics coming back with. If a vehicle's overheating, or if the airbag light is on, or the ABS light is, I mean, just that, safety aspect of keeping tabs on, because people like to give up their vehicle, especially if the vehicle's assigned to someone, right? And even in the police one, we certain departments to give people a take-home car, they don't want to give those cars up. I mean, it's like they think it's part of them, and they think they own it because it's assigned to them. And that's a big challenge with assigned vehicles, is getting them to come in for maintenance, because they don't want to give them up. They just, and in some cases, they'll get a loaner, but it's a piece of junk loaner or whatever. And on the other side of the coin, I had that problem. We have a loaner program in NYPD with 100-something vehicles. And we found out if we had a good loaner car, that would happen with the loaner car. If we gave them a new loaner car, they wouldn't want to give the loaner car back, right? Because everybody, yeah. So you got to have a loaner program where the car's not so good, so they give it back. That their main car is better than But those are just some. But the technology is just it takes all the guesswork out of fleet management. It really does, and that's fleet people coming into this job now. Fleet managers, they just have it so easy on that end of it, and you can really make your fleet super efficient. And on the other side, you can justify it so easy. If you need more vehicles, right? What you have the data showing that all your vehicles are being used, but you don't have enough. Even now with telematics, we have these snowstorms in the Northeast, right? Well, how many departments or cities now are putting the snowplow data, making available to the public? Oh, you want to see if the snowplow came down your block? We were getting snow a foot, a couple inches an hour, a foot every couple hours, right? So the snowplow might have came down, but you wouldn't know it, right? But now you can go online and see, well, the snowplow came down twice, but the street still looks like it has snow on it. So just so many things like that. And then we found it actually, just like the body-worn cameras on the cops, it's unbiased. Only tells the truth. So we would every once in a while get allegations that somebody was doing something that they shouldn't have been doing, or off base, or outside their geographical fence or where they should be. And the GPS would, we do an investigation. GPS would just support it on, well, was the person there or not, and so many times we would start an investigation, go to GPS, or in our case, we go GPS, and they have license plate readers now, so that would all, put the story together on what happened, on whether the person was there or not. But so all this technology just really makes fleet management so, and investigations, if you have to do that as well. But it protects the person because it only tells the truth.
I think recently we had been talking about technology and cameras specifically for safety in a previous article, and it was referred to as the silent witness. And I think that was probably one of my favorite ways of looking at this technology because it's that silent witness that's sitting there, but it's a witness that you can trust. Its memory
Mhm.
is not going to be messed up by a human memory. I mean, it's been proven that we think we remember things don't remember. And having that silent witness there for exoneration, for proof, has been so helpful. And I think if you can look at it that way, it's really made a difference.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I mean, a human witness is the worst witness. I'll tell you right now.
Yeah.
I have a little experience with that on my the other jobs that I had. And then once again, then just to go a little further on it, then we can also add predictive maintenance, right? We can use,
Yep.
because now we have companies that they actually analyze, was the vehicle, even now, was a vehicle used in snowstorms, is a vehicle used on highways, and depending on how the vehicle is used, you can predict, how often you should change brakes, whether you should change the battery, and using that telematics stuff, if you can monitor the voltage in the battery, you see the voltage dropping, well, don't wait for it to break down. That battery's on the way out, change the battery ahead of time. And you can really helps you to, what we used to say, keep the fleet in the street.
Yeah. Yeah. It's a lot more information than just hours and miles can give you.
Yep. Mhm. And that's another great point is now we can easily look at hours versus mileage, because idle time, obviously in the police world, we have so much idle time.
Yeah.
Now, with electric vehicles and hybrid, we reduce idle time a lot, but, the comparison is 1 hour of idle time is equal to 30 miles of wear and tear. Ballpark, and both Ford and General Motors, came out with those statistics. So that, now bringing in idle time, like we had tow trucks that would have 50,000 miles on it, but with idle time, it was equal to 1 million miles. That was the difference. Yeah.
That's a
So
huge
yeah,
difference.
yeah.
Well, Robert, I cannot tell you how much I appreciate you for hopping on with me and sharing your journey and all the insights that you've gained along the way. It's stories like yours that just help remind us that fleet is just so much more than vehicles and technology. It's the people that are driving the change. So, before we wrap, though, I want to give you the last word. Is there anything else you'd like to say to the folks watching or to your fellow fleet friends that are tuning in?
I would say, just make sure you operate as a team. Make sure you give everybody credit that deserves credit. Thank your team, and give them recognition. I always say, praise in public, reprimand in private. Still stands. There's some basic stuff. Encourage new idea. Encourage thinking outside the box. Be a mentor, be a leader, be a teacher. Let people learn from their mistakes, be fair, and do not tolerate or condone corruption.
Well, thank you again. And for everyone else, we hope you're walking away with some solid takeaways and maybe a little bit of inspiration too. If you've got thoughts on the episode, drop them in the comments. Know someone with a legendary story? Tell me who you want to see next. We've got more great conversations on the way, so stay curious, stay connected, and we'll see you on the next episode of Fleet Legends.